Hello, everybody. Welcome to Matriarch Illuminations, the final of a 5-part series hosted by Jessica Wood. My name is Lisa, and I'm a Master's of Public Policy and Global Affairs student at UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded. And second, there will be a Q&A near the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any questions you may have for Jessica and our guest this evening. This is where we'll be pulling our questions from when the time comes, so thanks so much. And with those out of the way, I just want to begin this evening by recognizing and acknowledging the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwangin, Songhees, WSÁNEĆ, and Coast Salish peoples in what is known as Victoria, BC, which is where I'm calling from today as an uninvited settler. I also wish to acknowledge the Musqueam people who host the UBC Vancouver campus that's brought us here together this evening for this important conversation. Since we're all joining on a virtual platform tonight, I'd invite you to also reflect on the Indigenous lands that you're calling in from today. When I reflect on this land acknowledgement, I think about how I personally came to know the history of this land, and it was actually through local Indigenous matriarchs here. And it made me realize that matriarchs hold such a powerful role when it comes to knowledge sharing, especially because land is more than just a physical space to recognize. It's a connection to knowledge that is shared by women and two-spirited individuals who continue being longstanding community leaders that uphold and protect the lands and waters in which we reside. And although it's not their work to educate settlers such as myself about colonization of these lands, I'm greatly appreciative for the opportunity to be called into a space that moves us forward in action. This dynamic series has just been one of these opportunities in which we've all been particularly fortunate to learn from these incredible matriarchs. And so with that, I wish to introduce you to the creator of Matriarch Illuminations, Jessica Wood. Jessica Wood, or Si Sityaawks, meaning Woman Who Creates Change, is a policy practitioner at our School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Jessica is from the Gitxsan and Tsimshian nations with extended roots to the Tahltan and Nisga'a Nations. Jessica serves as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Reconciliation, Transformation and Strategies Division with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliations for the province of BC. Jessica is leading BC's cross-ministry work to adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Canada's calls to action, as well as learnings from the relevant case laws such as the Silk Coating Nations. Today's theme is where we go from here, and it's my pleasure to also introduce our two special guests this evening, both of whom are incredible leaders at our School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, Professor Sheryl Lightfoot and Adjunct Professor Andrea Reimer. Sheryl Lightfoot is Canada's Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, an Associate Professor with UB School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Department of Political Science. Sheryl is one of the world's experts in global Indigenous politics, and her research specializes in complex questions of Indigenous people's rights and how these rights are being claimed and negotiated in various political spaces. Her work explores both practical and theoretical aspects of implementation of Indigenous rights globally, as well as in comparative domestic and regional contexts. Cheryl also currently serves as Senior Advisor to the UBC President on Indigenous Affairs. Cheryl is Anishinaabe from the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe. Andrea Reimer is an Adjunct Professor of Practice at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and our first Policy Practitioner Fellow. Andrea has been a strong public voice in Vancouver and the metro region for almost 2 decades, with a focus on working with residents to build green, reconciled, engaged communities and making government easy for the public to access. Andrea started her public work as an organizer in community efforts to achieve greater social, environmental, and economic justice. During her decade as City Council, Andrea spearheaded a number of initiatives, including the city's effort to be the greenest city on earth and Vancouver's nationally significant municipal framework for reconciliation with Indigenous people. So welcome Cheryl and Andrea to our discussion tonight. It is now my honor to turn it over to Jessica Wood.
Namaste. Hamia to Lisa. That was a wonderful and very warm introduction. And I'm honored tonight to be hosted by Women in Policy at the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And a special thanks to Tamara Baldwin, Lindsay Marsh, and Allison Mcfarlane for helping make tonight possible. I am so excited to both join my colleagues as well as to dig into, on such an amazing day actually. Today, the federal government introduced legislation regarding the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I have to say, it's left me breathless all day. This is something that we did in BC, and it changes the context so much of our conversation tonight. So I'm so honored. It's very timely to be joined by Andrea Reimer and Sheryl Lightfoot tonight. Please join me, and let's get into talking about what comes next. I think this is such an exciting time. We're at a pivot point again, almost a year to the day since Bill 41 received royal assent and became an act here in BC. And I'm so excited to dig into what we think of what comes next. Sheryl? Andrea, welcome.
Thank you, Jessica.
Sheryl, I'm so interested, you've worked so much globally, and you've dug into those pieces of international politics, particularly around Indigenous people. What are your thoughts on today? What brought us here, and where you think we are?
Oh, thanks for that, Jessica. And I also want to thank Lisa for the opening. Really appreciate the warm welcome. And we couldn't have timed this better. Congratulations, Jessica, because, and I can tell everyone, the three of us had a meeting, of course, by Zoom, earlier this week, very early in the week, and we were chatting about, well, what direction might we want to take the conversation? What are everyone's thoughts? And now this morning, again, very well planned, Jessica, we have a new piece of legislation that came out that fits particularly well in the theme. So all those notes that we had, we're just going to toss them aside and recreate this, because this is yet another path-breaking and historic day. And when I say another, it's because I'm referring to that day, and I was lucky enough to be in attendance when the BC legislation was tabled. And like you say, Jessica, it was just a bit over a year ago. We tabled it in late October, and then it passed in November. So a very short time frame. And that was, to put it mildly, a momentous day because it was the first piece of legislation to provide a framework for implementing the declaration anywhere on the planet. Was British Columbia. And of course, that made me incredibly proud to be living here and to have folks like you, Jessica, pushing that and making that a reality for all of us. And now, a year later, presuming this legislation passes, we will be the first nation state in the world to have this type of legislation. So that also makes me quite proud. So we'll start with the proud. We can dig into some of the technicalities and the and buts as we go, because I have plenty of those thoughts as well. But I did want to start from that framework. Now, that's not to say other countries aren't active. They are. And we've had several cases in Latin America where it has been enshrined into constitution or just whole scale added into law. Albeit without much thought about how that was going to actually happen. New Zealand has been working for the last year and a half plus, close to 2 years, on a national action plan. There was a working group that developed a plan and tabled their plan right before COVID. So that one is still up in the air. Plus there's been another election. So, these things have to get going again, as we know, following an election. So there are pockets of activity here and there, But I think we can just pause and give a moment's appreciation to where it is due, because none of these things happen in isolation. No one person makes them happen. And I don't have to tell you this, Jessica, there's a whole team of people pushing and co-drafting and co-developing. So there are, and we don't even know who all of them are, because they've all signed NDAs, of course, so non-disclosure agreements. So we don't even know how many folks had their hands in it, but I know in my heart that it's a significant number that have played roles, both large and small. So let's just pause for a moment and recognize the labor of each and every one of those people, both known and unknown to us.
I'll give that space for that, because it's a revolutionary concept. And this is where I have to speak to some folks who have helped lead the foundation for that change. Andrea, you and I first met when you were working for the city of Vancouver, the first city to actually become a city of reconciliation, not just for a year, but as an identity. And that has to have come from, honestly, that foundation piece. And that is what I believe has also supported this being successful, not just contemplated, considered, and tabled in BC, but actually be successful, is because of all of those early efforts of different bodies, levels of government, institutions, and leadership like your own. So we're here today seeing how different pieces of work go on to have lives of their own. And I imagine you have your own reflections on today before we get into the details and the pieces. What are your thoughts?
Oh, so many. Well, I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Lisa for the really, really beautiful and thoughtful welcome to tonight, to open us up in a really good way, and to acknowledge the, well, the Musqueam who were acknowledged, but also the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations who are the folks whose unceded homelands that I am on here in East Vancouver and who UBC's campus is on. So I'm just always very grateful to be welcome here. And many members of all three nations who've supported me in my own sort of metaphorical and actual journey home as an Indigenous woman who was adopted out of my community and finding my pathway back home to my nation, which is Korean, Métis, and Kainai. So yeah, very grateful for the welcome that I get. So how do I feel today? Yeah, I mean, I thought it was yesterday. So we had this false start and I was all excited. And then we were talking before this call started about the challenge of time change and Ottawa time versus Vancouver time. So by the time it happened, I'd had plenty of time to reflect on it. And this, Jessica, sort of what you point to, right? This incredibly long journey. I mean, I picked up this baton in 2008, when I was elected to City Council, not knowing at the time that I was Indigenous, but feeling very compelled and passionate about action to deal with impacts that we were seeing in the community. And, you know, I was picking it up from a lot of people before me who tried to do things, and we did studies and we made proclamations and declarations, and finally the City of Reconciliation, and then the provincial action that you've been such an integral quarterback in, and then today to hear a national government. When Sheryl like contextualizes it, this is it on planet Earth, to hear a national government. The whereas is the preamble in the legislation is deeply meaningful for Canadians, and not unlike, you know, when we were doing this at the city in like 2000, 2012, 2013 is when we made the declaration of the Year of Indigenous Peoples, which at the time was like considered, you know, just super revolutionary, and maybe something really bad would happen because we've made this very clear declaration of truth about colonization and unceded homelands and all of these things that at the time were in some ways disputed in their absence, right? Like maybe if we didn't talk about these things, they didn't happen. But by talking about them, suddenly we were daylighting the reality of the past that we suddenly had to confront. And it was dangerous and difficult. But there were 3 people at the council meeting. Sorry, there was all of council, but then there were 3 people watching that when it happened. And this morning actually made me feel that way, that it was like in amongst COVID and vaccine plans and all this stuff, was just this like quiet little moment that was deeply meaningful for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people across the country who all kind of had their own moment with it. But collectively, we still need to find a way to connect, not, I mean, on the legislation, but on the kind of work that's pushing it forward, right? Like that piece has never really happened for us. I think you pulled it off in BC when you did the legislation, but that in general, we don't get these moments, and that like that's got to be what's next, is a way to connect that tissue.
It's so interesting. I have both revelation and PTSD from our experience. I should preface all of this with saying I'm not here tonight in my role as ADM with the province. I'm here as a fellow, and so all the provisos that nothing I say tonight represents the province of British Columbia, given I am a particular I play a particular role in reference to this topic. Having said all of that, to hear from a very different perspective the machinations over all the content there, and to hear you, Cheryl, talk about what other jurisdictions have tried in the world, and just adopting the Declaration into their constitution, and both the BC and the federal document recognize that the constitution we have already contains this. It's like daylighting what you're saying, Andrea, you bring out the truth in a different way. And I remember that moment with the city, with the first year with the Declaration, and how words like unseated and everybody went, and I don't know that folks have totally let down their shoulders and exhaled their breath, because but it makes room. And so what I'm excited about is that there's potential for actual movement that has actually been building this entire time in the Crown Indigenous relationship, whatever you want to call it, colonization. There's always been this potential for a transformative, healthy outcome and relationship and dynamic. And to actually see it start to actualize in different ways is just it's so good. It's so hopeful. And that to me is what's so important about matriarchy and how that influences me. So earlier this week, we were joined by Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafont, which is also a very serendipitous timing, given she just released the health report. And she spoke about how things change when matriarchs are in the room. When they're at the table, when they're making policy, when they're making decisions. And I feel that here too, that there's room for matriarchy in policy making. There's room for this, and there's a history of it. But that theme of daylighting, things that are true, and the cyclical nature of all of this is really is something that I'm still sitting with. It's still talking to me in a way. I'm not really sure what it's trying to say yet. But I will say there's some caution I have in this. We often have hopeful moments and pivot points. And often as governments, we don't realize our potential. And so for me, what comes next is also how do we achieve that potential? What do we need to do? Who needs to be in the room? How do we get there? And Andrea, you talked about something about, I can't remember what it was when we talked earlier, because I try and keep up, Andrea, but you're so smart, and you take theories and you make them accessible when we talk. So there was a piece that you were talking about, like who you invite in and how you change the cycle, or even recognize that there is one. Can you touch on that again? Is that ringing true for you today?
Oh yeah, a lot. So so here's the part in Matriarch Illuminations where I try and use my hands to show you a somewhat complex diagram. So we were talking about this concept of two loops and emergent systems. So there's an idea, a theory in systems theory, that you have a dominant culture. I mean, obviously you have a dominant culture, but that one way to approach it, to approach systems change, is that you try to mitigate the most negative things happening in that, right? So reconciliation, in my opinion, is that. It was like, oh, and I spoke to it when I made my remarks in the opening, right? These terrible things were happening. There were murders and death rates and overdoses and like so many awful things happening and so badly disproportionately hitting Indigenous people. You can't help but say something is not working about this system, right? And we need to fix it. So reconciliation was like, okay, dominant system is like at the bottom of its loop. If we do this thing, it'll bring it back up and it'll function like super well, right? But this two loops concept is that actually we need a totally different system, that even when this dominant system performs at peak performance, it's not great for everybody, right? So then you've got one loop here, you're trying to get over to this other loop, so you need a bridge across it. You need basically people who can walk people, like, so this one loop starts going this way and you want the other one going that way, this emergent system, and you need people who can like sort of actually for it's sort of a hospice zone where you sort of take people who are suffering from the dominant and try and transport them over to emergent and build this emergent system. So in my mind, that is actually exactly where we're at right now. Like reconciliation was, I still think it's a very deeply important thing, but not the way we were talking about it in 2012 and 2013. Like that was the hospice zone where we were just trying to keep people and communities and culture and language, and I think hope in some ways alive long enough that we could live to see this day where we could imagine this emergent system where we don't have to meet Canada where it's at, it's meeting us where we're at.
That is such a revolutionary idea. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so I'm going to, Cheryl, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to mute, but I'm going to come back. When you think of that, when you think of the theories, you've seen so many systems tackle, struggle, approach. What is the advice that you have about what to consider next? And I put some provisos on this. I have seen you treat your role at carrying this knowledge with such respect and honoring culture in a way that even through academia holds its highest exemplary form. And that's like a vague way of saying, when I approached you about the legislation and looking for help and looking for input, you asked me some really direct and tough questions about who was in the room, who got to see it first, how we were engaging with nations, how we were engaging with leadership. And there are so many lessons just from those first few conversations we had before you ever laid eyes on the legislation that I found so powerful and instructive, and I carry with me. And so I imagine now that you can see sort of the guides for that transition, and folks who may have some wisdom who have either made the one-way journey or who come back and forth, how you welcome that in.
Well, thanks for that, Jessica. I really appreciate it. And I do remember those conversations because I got this very professional, direct, formal email about I was being invited to give an advanced look at the BC draft legislation and offer my opinions. And of course, I was happy to do so, but my upbringing, my ethics, my sense of protocol required that my next questions were asked before I ever said yes or no or thought about the timing, because I wanted to make sure that I was stepping in at a place that was appropriate in terms of the timing of who's seen it first. And so I needed to ask, have Indigenous leaders already seen it? Have Indigenous experts from BC already seen it? Because it is a piece of BC legislation, therefore it's for British Columbia. I'm from very far away, and so I like to make sure that I followed proper protocol. And I think sometimes people interpret that as a lack of confidence or a hesitancy, and that's not at all what it is. It's a plain respect to the order of things, to knowledge holders, and to those whose territory and lands these are, and recognizing my place in that. So I appreciate, Jessica, that you recognize that, and that I was actually approaching that I was honoring my own cultural background and paying respect to the people of this place. And when I think about that, I mean, it's what I was taught as a young child, and I'm going to take us back, way back then. Let's not talk about exactly how far back that was, but the roots of the declaration that we're talking about today in terms of what's next go way back to the 70s. And the very first documents that, and there were two documents in our collective history on both sides of the border that eventually became the Declaration. And one, of course, was here in Port Alberni with the World Council of Indigenous Peoples way back when, their initial Declaration of Principles. And the other one was at Standing Rock, South Dakota. And I know we've all heard that place before when we talk about recent conflicts and recent events. And Standing Rock is one of those places that you keep hearing about if you follow Indigenous activist history, because it will show up over and over and over again. It's just one of those special places where movements are born. And the document that came from that conference back in 1974, like the one here in Port Alberni, everyone was present. Women, elders, traditional leaders, healers, little kids running around everywhere. Everyone was there, and it was done in a community way. And when you take a look at the text from those early documents to the first draft of the Declaration, and I have done this like a word for word analysis, you're seeing 85% of the principles that came out of those two earliest documents that were community-based, community-written, hammered out over many cups of coffee and long nights of drinking coffee. That's what we have in front of us today in its form of the Declaration. And so that document that we're now talking about today, that we may finally get into Canadian legislation, comes from a very special place. And because it wasn't just written by lawyers in a back room, and it wasn't written just by men sitting around haggling it out, it had a fulsome debate and discussion, and came from very traditional people being themselves, who wanted the dignity and the space to continue to be themselves. And I think that's not only a lesson in the content, but it's a lesson in how to be, how to interact with one another, how to ground ourselves. And so in the work that I do on the Declaration, I always try to make sure that I'm doing that work in a way that honors those principles of the Declaration, and that honors those very traditional roots of all of those folks, most of whom have left us by now. And so I honor their memory and their legacy. So thanks so much for the question, Jessica. Advice on next steps. Well, can I just do one of the and buts now? Is it time to enter that? Okay, because now I can really have fun. So my first yes but is that this legislation is 5 years past due, at least. The TRC called for this in 2015 as one of its calls to action, call number 43, and they said at that time in 2015 that the UN Declaration is the framework for reconciliation in Canada. No other framework is acceptable. And so while I'm very glad to see this day, you know, why did it take 5 years to create a piece of legislation that is simply a human rights standard? It's the only human rights standard that Canada has ever voted against in the UN system. So that's something to be proud of. Canada, well done. And the only one that has been up for policy debate for now 13 years. So that's a big yes, but, and I'd like everyone to sit on that and contemplate that for a moment.
I think you bring up a really important point that brings me back to our Constitution in terms of the yes, buts. We've had Section 35 in the Constitution since 1982, which focuses directly on the rights of Indigenous people. Technically, Aboriginal people, but that is another yes, but. But at the same time that that was introduced, we brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for Canada. And we have wrapped ourselves in that. We have embraced it. We believe that it should apply equally and equitably to all citizens. And we use it as a tool to ensure that standard. And I agree with you. These are the minimum standards for the survival and dignity of Indigenous people. We are articulating things that already have application in Canadian law. These are not new. Neither pieces of these legislation have introduced something that wasn't applicable before they were introduced. It doesn't change. It highlights a commitment, a legislated obligation to do specific work and specific things and to strive for cooperation, but it puts that obligation on the government, but not to do anything that isn't lawful, that isn't already lawful and part of our Constitution. I think that's something really to consider. There's so many of us that benefit from the Charter and yet don't get to fully realize it because of everything from the Indian Act to the limitations that are put on to the question of what we can articulate and accept about the humanity of Indigenous people. So I love that you bring in that history, that you bring in the root of where this wisdom comes from, that it's Indigenous wisdom, that it's generational, that it is part of the legal pluralism that we already live with. This is Indigenous law and how we get there. And that this is the affirmation for the first times in these legal traditions, which are very young compared to the length of law for Indigenous people in the country and our nations, to affirm that humanity. But it is still a very young country. It is still a very young nation. These are still very young jurisdictions. And I think about what that must be like for our elders who come in and they see this and they go, I imagine, we get that feedback that we're acting good or we think we know, and they ask us our questions. What questions do you have? And we give them. And then they don't answer them. They just go, because they just wanted to know where we were at. And I feel like this is telling us where we're at. This is the questions we're asking ourselves. Is this okay? Can we do this? And I really appreciate that history and how laid bare that has to be, and on the truths of so many survivors and those who are no longer with us, and the power of those stories that pull us through that timeline. And I honor them, because we don't even know, and that's what I'm hoping some of the work that we highlight today, and that will inspire those that are interested or working in policy or law, to see that the work they do, even if it's over cups of coffee through the night, may breathe life into something many, many years later. So having said that, there are some yes buts in today. There are some yes buts and there's some wisdom in this room that I know we have a short time together tonight. It feels really short because I feel like we're coming up on questions. When you were, I'm assuming, Andrea, you've had a chance to dig into, and you brought up the whereas, the preambular, which I'll admit, we don't have one in BC, because in BC, preambles are considered part of the law, and they can lead to unintended interpretations of law. So we've done away with the convention, but the federal government has that opportunity, and it was fascinating to dig through that. My favorite so far is the preamble that references Two-Spirit people. And that's the second time in Canadian legislation that we've actually referenced Two-Spirit people. The first being the anti-conversion law. So I'm interested in your yes buts and your inspiration from this, and what you notice, what sticks out for you.
Yeah, the whereases were pretty expansive. Like, we would not have gotten those if that was law. If they had legal force, we would not have gotten them. But I think perhaps closer, and bearing in mind yeah, I am so, I wasn't, well, I was born into my culture and then taken away from it, and like now trying to get, develop a relationship again with it, and sort of realizing my blood found its way home a long time before I knew it was there on a lot of this work, but it's a bit of a complex. I see the world both as a non-Indigenous person and an Indigenous person, and relate to the work I've done as both non-Indigenous and Indigenous. So it's a bit of it's hard for me to unravel sometimes. Reading it today, though, I felt like the meaning within that law was so much closer to an Indigenous way of telling law, of being law, right? Like, saying it has power. It's about integrity, and it's about your word meaning something, right? So I feel like it met both the many nations involved, but the Indigenous nations, plural, and the nation of Canada came together in those whereases in a way you rarely see in governance, right? But yeah, thinking back, like you mentioned the unceded earlier, the City of Vancouver passed this motion in 2014. So we had this framework for reconciliation because nobody was really talking about it as well. Governments weren't talking about it in early part of the 2010s. So we sort of had to create a static definition for it in order for it to exist. So the definition was, there's three parts. You got to tell the truth. You have to make the room for Indigenous people to tell the truth about the reality of colonization and the impacts it's had on them and their communities and their families. Then you need to make the space for non-Indigenous people to acknowledge what they've heard in a meaningful way. So the city, and the third part was New Pathway Forward Together, in case you're wondering. But the second part, after the year of reconciliation, the city is like, how do we acknowledge, like, what gesture do you give that shows you acknowledge hearing 100,000 people speak in various venues, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all the hearings, the survivors, there's so much. And the only, the City of Reconciliation was one response to that, but the second was this declaration that we were on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And it seemed, it's so freaking obvious. And yet there was a firestorm. We had national, federal ministers, tweeting, and the Minister of Justice provincially was like, this is the end of all things, like cats and dogs will literally fall from the sky. Like, you cannot do this. And I was like, wow, that's the power. There's so much power in these words. There's no truth changed from us passing that motion, but us committing them to paper and voting on them is what matters. And it's what matters about this act that Bill C-15 that's happening right now. But in terms of what's next, I mean, the yes, the and, but after the whereas is a somewhat disappointing commitment to 3 years of pain and suffering and developing an action plan that may or may not meet any of the things we're talking about here, right? Like whether or not it meets the tests, the feelings, desires, aspirations, hopes, needs, desperation in Indigenous communities in many cases will fall largely on Indigenous people. And I would say largely on Indigenous women to show up and keep pushing on some of the key aspects that need to be in that action plan. So what's next is a lot of work, right? I think what's different is that work isn't being done alone. It's not being done in a dark place, right? Like, we're out into the light and having these discussions. People show up to hear us talk about things and hopefully, take these conversations into their communities and help keep building the amount of daylight that, again, there's that word again, that this is all being brought out into the daylight. And that gives me more hope for what can be in that document 3 years from now.
Doesn't have to take 3 years.
I'm with you on that, sister. It shouldn't have to. I mean, I have a consulting firm in addition to teaching, and I'm doing a contract right now. that involved reading 16 documents that have been produced just in the last 10 years relating to a particular issue and Indigenous women, each of which commits to pretty much the same set of actions. But each of these 16 documents gets produced. There's like, it's that two loops I showed you, like some champion needs to take this and like portage it over to the emergent system, right? Like allow it to flourish over there in this new world. The dominant system cannot serve these needs.
You bring up a point, because we have RCAP, we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, we've had the provincial inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Before there was a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There was the Stolen Sisters report from Amnesty International. Like, I can name the matriarchs, Bev Jacobs, like we can name them. And we keep passing that baton and we keep proving the experience. And I'm kind of like, I am, Brenda Butterworth-Carr, who was on earlier, talked about the euphoria. I talk about the potential, the excellence, and I am ready for it. I am ready to put down the baton and stop racing towards, stop racing for survival and start getting into that thriving and that excellence. And it's happening. We're reclaiming it, we're rematriating, we're passing laws. This one is potential, but I'm really interested in that new piece. Now, I wonder sometimes, and this is it's a common metaphor, and we see it in fishing communities, we see it in gardening, that there's this like last gasp when, you'll have a major run of fish and everybody will go, see, it's all okay. And we're like, that's it. Our old people are saying there's no more. Don't touch them. They're trying one last push for the whole run, that, the blooms are coming because they're going to try and seed everywhere to start anew. And that's where I feel like we're at with a certain kind of colonialism, with a certain kind of systemic racism, is that we're actually at, this overtness is really that final gasp of what else will come next and grow and take its place. So I believe you. I have to say, shout out to Ginger Gosnell-Myers. Speaking of Indigenous women in leadership positions and her role, it was an honor to work alongside her on a couple of things with the city and with yourself. And I really believe that is shifting by matriarchs and aunties and people taking their place and not making themselves small. And saying those truths and trying to fit ourselves so that we can get in the door and not be too much trouble and make a bit of progress. I'm ready for the full beauty and euphoria and potential that isn't based on a reaction to settlerism, that isn't based on an identity that is about that centering that experience of colonialism that we get to reclaim in that other system, that we get to find ourselves in a different cycle. I'm so excited for that. I think we have the potential. I'm conscious of time. I can see little flashes. This happens every time. Are you two ready for questions? Is there anything you want to cover before we open up the floor? Cheryl, Andrea?
Yeah, I just want to echo that sentiment, Jessica, because I think, and I was going to bring up the point that actually, we've been doing this a long time. RCAP was decades ago, and actually, what we're talking about now is still what they found in their report. This has been a long time in the making, and yet I still see it all as part of the same transition, the same transformation. Okay, so it's taking decades. No one ever promised it was going to be one particular pivot point. Sometimes a pivot point is a bundle of years, but we're in it now, and it is happening. And no longer are is Canada in a position to credibly continue its pattern of denial? That there are Indigenous peoples here that have rights, that have title. It now has to deal with that. And what I really embrace is the world is watching. All of this brings an extra visibility, an extra layer of accountability. And as much as Canada loves to go to the international level and make big claims about its progress, there are always many folks there ready to call that out and make it sure it's accurate and say, oh, no, Canada is just now making baby steps to deal with its actual long-standing culture, systems, institutions that have been set up to deny the pre-existence and the preoccupation and the pre-nationhood, the inherent nationhood of Indigenous peoples here. And that game's over. Welcome to the 21st century. We're on a new path now. So with that, I'll take questions.
That's great. And Andrea, that just touches on for me, and I know they're going to be like questions, but touches on for me, you have already been a part of something in a government that has shown that you can pivot that and the sky doesn't fall and the city doesn't come to a halt and the world comes to an end. I think the experience of what that experience that you described is having so many things come at you and so many things come at the city for even daring to articulate what so many people articulate every day, and just to take that on and say the truth, and yet here you are. Here the city is.
You remember, Jessica, in the chamber, in the legislature last year, Sheryl Casimir cracked a joke. She's head of the First Nations Summit, and she said, "Okay, everyone, did you hear that? The sky did not fall." Look at us. And again, this legislation was tabled today, and last time I checked, sky is still there.
It's hard to tell in Vancouver sometimes, but yes, behind the cloud, I am fairly confident.
It's good. Lisa, you're keeping us on time. Thank you.
Yeah, I can just start with the first question here from Patrick. So Patrick asks, how can we ensure Indigenous grassroots values, cultural and legal traditions are reflected in the work that must be done to implement Undrip both in BC and the Canadian context? Indigenous political representatives have not always been exemplary conduits for grassroots community needs and aspirations.
A much bigger question than it might appear if you're not intimately familiar with Indigenous politics. I guess what I would say is like, yeah, okay, the smallest answer I think I can give, all governments are, a government is an aggregate of the people. So if a government is not good and not representing the best aspirations of a people, it's because the people aggregating into it are very small, either because a self-interested group has figured out how to hijack the process, as we may have seen down south in the US for a period of time, or because folks don't have the capacity to participate, right? So, I mean, there is a theory that people are just too lazy or apathetic, but I don't subscribe to that. But just for the sake, because we're in an institution, a scholarly institution, I will note that there is a branch of scholarship that says that that could also be true. So then the question is like, which problem are you trying to solve there, right? You can't help self-interested people be less self-interested. That's just not going to happen. So then you need legal interventions. But beneath all of that, I would say that these governments, like this is my point about having to meet Canada where they're at, like there's so many broken, shattered infrastructure of communities. Like many of the communities across Canada did not have these forms of governance historically, right? I mean, nor did they have children abducted and tortured in residential school. So which break was the worst could be one way of talking about it, but another way of talking about it is like, what if we got to go home? I mean, that both literally and metaphorically to what was, and Canada had to meet governments where they're at then? Like, would that help these values be more expressed? Because I think a lot of it is the way the knots get tied to try and, you know, meet some standard that the Canadian government's put on the table to meet their standard, which frankly doesn't work well for a lot of people either. Like, what was our turnout in the last, like 52%? And like, the poorer you are, the browner you are, the less likely you were historically to see yourself reflected in, anyway, I could go on. So it's not like there's a colonial government with a system that it's imposed that I think creates a lot of the challenges. And until that's solved, we just do the best we can to try and like portage over to that new world, that emergent system.
Thank you.
Well,
Cheryl, go ahead.
I am all too familiar with Indigenous politics on multiple levels, so I'm gonna chew on that from a few different angles and perspectives. So, and pick up part of what Andrea was saying. So, one of the difficult features of the current Indigenous political landscape is the fact that chiefs and council on reserves are creations of the Indian Act, which is one of the most colonial, paternalistic pieces of legislation from the 19th century, not even 1 century ago, but 2 centuries ago, still on the books, still in play. And I have to note that the legislation tabled today is going to be very inconsistent with the Indian Act. So that is going to be something. There are several articles in this act or paragraphs in this act today that are going to, sooner or later, raise that question about the legitimacy of the Indian Act. And so there is going to need to be a huge discussion about what's next, because that's not a simple answer. It's one thing to repudiate the Indian Act. It's another thing to figure out what should go in its place. And that's going to involve a huge number of discussions. And then, of course, we have also the very thorny issue of elected leadership on reserves with that particular jurisdiction. And then we have hereditary leaders who are responsible for and accountable to their entire traditional territories. Those are very different concepts, and yet we have both already existing. And this is where I'm also going to mention one of the biggest differences between the BC legislation, again, already passed into law, and the legislation tabled today on the federal level. And I don't have to tell you, Jessica, you know what's in the BC legislation. And one of its provisions that I was so excited about and remain very excited about is the inclusion of Indigenous governing bodies, not simply Indian Act banned chiefs and council. So BC opened up a space for something very new to come onto the table and to pick up conversations and see where they go. Today's act on the federal level is specifically limited to the constitutionally recognized groups. So First Nations, Inuit, and Métis as the federal government sees them. So congratulations again on the BC legislation, because when we begin to look about when we begin to look at innovative aspects and creative decision-making approaches, BC has really taken that particular issue in a whole new direction. Where it goes, we don't know yet, because it's still very early on in the implementation phase of the BC legislation. But I'll leave that there, and we can move on to another question, because I could talk about this for the entire hour.
Thanks, Cheryl. The only thing I'll say there is careful where you draw the line on grassroots. And I'll say in that regard, don't let the blazer fool you. There are many people who who have hereditary names and positions who work in many different places. And in that regards, I want to do honor and right by those. I mean, Romeo Saganash put forward a bill that was the foundation, that was not successful at the time, but was the foundation for our bill here. And as Cheryl has highlighted, came from, has a long history through you know, to the development of the UN Declaration itself, and all of that work that people have pulled together. I think I would encourage folks to consider that self-determination allows for nations and Indigenous people to choose, and that is the purpose of Indigenous governing bodies. That is the work of nations to do. That is the work of nations to reclaim and choose how they choose to organize. And that is a collective right held by Indigenous people. And it's time that jurisdictions respect that. It's actually ironic, Cheryl, because that is mentioned in two pieces of federal legislation, C-91 and 92. So we borrow from it, and it doesn't necessarily echo back, but there's, like I said, those seeds are out there. So thank you. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Jessica. Would you have time for one more question before we tie everything up? Okay. Mina asks that today they watched a webinar on IPCAs and learned a new concept, ethical space. It sounds great. Are you using it?
Who would want to answer no to such a question?
I hope so. I don't know enough about the concept.
I think it's, I'm thinking that it's referring to, there's this idea that, I think it comes out of Australia, that you have like, you know, the dominant culture space and then not dominant culture, and that there's this tug of war about whose space you're going to meet in. I don't even know that it needs to be dominate or not. And I mean like metaphorical space. But this idea of the third space or ethical space is the place to develop and meet. Assuming that's what she's talking about. At one point, in fact, for quite a while in the work I was doing on reconciliation, and again, because like nobody had talked about it enough for there to be definitions, so you sort of had to like literally draw people a picture and be like, here on the whiteboard, this is what we're talking about. And the third space or ethical space was something I talked about a lot. I'm less enamored of it of late. I sort of feel like the last 150 years, we've been spending a lot of time over in Canada's space, and I think it's time for them to come spend some time in our space. And I know maybe that's unethical, and I'm not suggesting that's what Mina was putting forward, but I just feel like the breaks need a balance, and the balance is not us moving halfway from Canada, right? It's being able to come home. And it does give me a little bridge. The last thing I would say is around storytelling. I really wanted to get in that the stories we tell ourselves really matter. Listening to Mary Ellen and to Tanya, I didn't get a chance to listen to the other two, but I suspect it was very similar. And this idea, you know, this intimate conversation you've created, Jessica, in the Matriarch Illuminations. Stories matter so much in all cultures, but the Indigenous cultures get that. And the non-Indigenous one wants a lot of things written down, and it ignores the story it tells itself. So as long as Canada and Canadians tell themselves that they're good people who showed up into this empty land and did all these amazing things through sheer heroics to build a nation, and that's how we got to modern Canada, we all lose from that, right? We need the truth about those times, not just like the shitty things for sure, but sorry, Allison, the not so excellent things that happened. But also the many stories of mutual aid, the Squamish coming and saving Vancouverites who, like a fire would have wiped out every human in the city if not for that moment, right? So many stories across the territories that just don't get told because they don't balance with the story we tell ourselves, which is false, about the birth of modern Canada. And that needs to change if anything's going to change.
I don't think there's anything to be said after that, Andrea. Just mic drop. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here tonight, but also being on the other end of the phone. When I've called for help, or you've reached out and been like, so how's it going? I appreciate the leadership that you share. I appreciate how you uplift other matriarchs, how you uplift the work, and you do honor to it. And I'm so honored to share this space with you and to have shared that with so many others. So thank you for joining me tonight and for joining all of us. Hi, Allison. I love that you've joined the 3 Indigenous folks with the UBC school. Welcome.
And for those of you out there who don't know, I'm Allison Mcfarlane. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And you know, you've all seen what a fantastic event this was. And I just want to make a special thank you to Jessica for leading this amazing series. I wish it could go on forever. I think it's something that's absolutely so important. But first, before I get into thanking you, let me first acknowledge the other two amazing women in the room, Sheryl Lightfoot and Andrea Reimer. Sheryl has done amazing work for the university, leading us and helping to develop the Indigenous Strategic Plan. We're the first Canadian university to adopt a human rights-based approach to its Indigenous strategic framework, and really it's largely thanks to Sheryl's really heavy lifting on this, so thank you, Sheryl. And Andrea has just been an amazing addition to our school. I know all our faculty feel this way, and all our students do too. She's just become this incredibly important person, and you hear her wisdom tonight. I mean, it's really special. And Andrea, you should know I'm a field geologist, so you know, coarse language is my language, just so you know. But I do want to spend a few seconds just thanking Jessica for putting together this amazing series. You know, really, it's been fantastic, and it's so important for a policy school, especially at a Canadian university, to be highlighting Indigenous relations and Indigenous ways of knowing, and bringing it into the school and making it part of what we do and how we do. And I want to see a lot more of that. And I really thank you, Jessica, in providing that leadership, and to all three of you for providing that leadership, because nothing is going to happen without that kind of leadership at our policy school. So thank you again. And thanks, Jessica, for all your hard work on this series. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to host it with the UBC school, and to have a wonderful space that we could invite you all into. And with that, we will draw this year's series of Matriarch Illuminations to a close. Thank you to those who are already so involved and committed to the school, and to Andrea for first reaching out to me to see if I'd be interested in working with the school and coming up with something. And this is the birth, this is the life given to that conversation. And to you as well, Sheryl, who does so much work to pave the way at UBC. Thank you so much. And Allison, for giving us the space and room to do so. Thank you. Everybody, good night. Be well, be safe. Gitxsan.